Hello, and welcome to the Bastine Brief. I am Ronique Bastine Robinson, the owner of the Bastine Law Group, and this is episode 2. I would like to welcome back my panelists from my inaugural session, Yasmin Cuddy, Misty Dennis, and Katie Custer. Today, we are going to be talking about small businesses and the ownership of those and their impact on divorce cases. So, Misty, let me start with you. How often do you get an opportunity to represent small business owners?
A fair amount. Sometimes we're talking small business such as a food truck. Other times we're talking something that's a little bigger, but that's a family-owned business like someone who owns a strip mall. So it depends. But I definitely see them on a fairly regular basis.
And Katie and Yasmin, do you all as well in your practices have the opportunity to represent small business owners?
I do. We see them quite frequently. And again, they range from small to medium. But yeah, I see a lot of them.
And Yasmin, I know in our past episode, you were talking about people who were employed at Fortune 500 companies. And so sometimes when we talk about small, that's not small necessarily. What have you seen in your practice in terms of size?
Well, I mean, I represented a wide range of people from large companies, oil and gas, physicians, but I also have clients that are small business owners. Maybe they own several gas stations or leases for gas stations, or they own tire companies like Discount Tires, those types of things, and or grocery stores. And I do have a lot of clients in the Ismaili community in Sugar Land that run those kinds of businesses, jewelry, wholesale jewelry. And so I think what I run across is figuring out, first off, inception of title. When were these companies formed? Was it during the marriage? Was it before the marriage? After the marriage? Is the company just doing business as, or is it an LLC, an S Corp? And just starting from step one in assessing those kinds of cases.
And so let's talk about that, because Yasmin brought up something really interesting, and that is the actual type of business, the formation. How do you, Katie, handle when you have a DBA versus an LLC versus an S Corp?
Well, I mean, it's going to structure how the business is run and how the cash flow operates. And so I think it's important to, when you have a client that comes in and when you assess the type of business that they own and how they're running it and how it's been formed, getting the formation documents, finding out who are the key players. Is there a CPA that's involved? Are there, third-party checks and balances that are involved, like a CPA? Or is the CPA a family member? I mean, so all of these things are important to investigate when somebody walks into your office and they start talking about specifically family-owned businesses, but also really any, like if they are the only ones running the business, just trying to figure out who all the key players are involved so that you know where you can ask the questions and whether or not you're going to have issues with getting information or credible information in order to assess value.
Misty, what has been your experience when you've represented a small business owner in terms of just the development of the case itself?
Understanding how the business is run. A lot of times when you have people who have small businesses, and we're talking again, a grocery store or a gas station, right? How expenses are paid. Are the expenses paid out of business? Are personal expenses paid out of the business? Has it been formatted in such a way that it is completely separate from their personal life and their personal expenses and things of that nature? So one of the first things that I talk about when I meet someone and they tell me that they have a small business is the structure. How is it structured? Do we have accounts in the name of the business? Who's on those accounts? Who has access to those accounts? How is the debt structured? Are the credit cards in your name and you're using your personal credit cards to buy stuff for the business? Those things are all very important in determining how this business is going to be considered an asset in the divorce and how it's going to be divided in the divorce and really the entire structure of how that business is considered.
Okay. And has anybody else experienced where one spouse is not necessarily a part of the business? They know about the business and they know that the business is actually funding the family, but they aren't a part of the business. But when the divorce is about to happen, that they want to destroy the business along with the spouse. Has anybody experienced that?
Yeah. 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 And I think the one thing that gets lost in translation in those scenarios is that what's good is for the goose is good for the gander. And if you're going to destroy the business, then the spouse, there you go too. So that's a hard conversation to have with the scornful spouse. But I think it's a very important conversation. And again, we talked in the previous episode about transparency and having red flags and some clients, and that is certainly a red flag. And if you can't get that back on track, that may be a question that you ask yourself about representation.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And so in that process, though, let's talk about the value, right? They're talking about, okay, I want to take this person out, but then you want to talk about, okay, well, let's talk about the value. What value is it bringing? When you are looking at a small business, what tools are you using to determine what that business is worth? Yasmin?
Well, that's a great question. If I'm representing the non-earning spouse and the other side has given me little to nothing regarding the actual business, the first thing I'll do is subpoena the bank records, whether it's the business bank accounts or the personal bank accounts. And I will just sit down with my paralegal and we'll go through and look at how much money is being deposited into all the various bank accounts each month, how much is being withdrawn. And if I'm seeing that there's like $60,000, $70,000 coming into bank accounts and like $60,000, $70,000 going out, that's my first, like, okay, this business is sustaining, collections of at least $60,000 a month. And we'll do the forensics and we'll look through, and try to give the client an idea. Hey, it looks like your spouse is collecting, $900,000 over 12 months and there's nothing to show for it. There's no retirement accounts, there's no this or that, and they're trying to start becoming transparent. If I think there's some assets and it's a small business, I try to get my client to agree to either get a joint expert or an expert immediately, because we're going to now need to add the company to the lawsuit, get them, propound discovery on the small business, get everything that we need, and have somebody actually get in there and value the business. I think that for an attorney to try to do that on their own, that is very, very difficult. I think that's where you need to get an expert involved.
I think you brought up two really good topics. One is an expert. And I think that's really important to know when you've gotten to a point, because when you said that you and your paralegal will sit down and go through the forensics, my heart sort of skipped a little beat, because I said the first thing that I'm going to do is get on the phone and call one of my experts that I have used in business valuations to determine what exactly is the value of this business, because the business owner is going to tell you it's worth nothing, right? They want you to believe that there's nothing there. It's just my hard work. And then you've got the spouse that have been reaping all of the benefits and the vacations and the home and the lifestyle. And they're like, well, yeah, it's worth a lot, right? So when you're standing in front of a judge, how are you telling that judge what that business is really worth?
I mean, the credible evidence would be from expert testimony, somebody who's going to tick and tie the numbers, somebody who's going to, I think, to Yasmin's point, like doing the initial smell test to say, hey, I can see that the money's going in, the money's going out, and there's nothing funny going on, but we still need to get a value for this business. Kind of will set the temperature for a client. Or in the alternative, when you say, well, I mean, the money's coming in, it's not really going out, or it's not going out on business expenses. We need to value it, but we also need to discern what could be part of a possible reimbursement, or even time, toil, and effort. Like if it's a separate property business, are we skirting money away from the community that would otherwise be distributed into the community, because your separate property business is making money, but you're not putting it back into the community. as income. So there's a lot of things to do. I mean, I think that's great to sit down and do that initial smell test, so you can at least forge a path with the client. But ultimately, at the end of the day, having an expert come in and evaluate the profits and losses, the QuickBooks, the bank statements, if the company has assets in it, to value the assets, so that it all goes on into the calculation for the valuation. And at the end of the day, when you're standing in front of a judge, I think a judge is probably going to give a lot more weight and credibility to what expert Joe is saying rather than my client.
Right. A lot of times what I find is that explaining to your client the process of hiring an expert, the benefits of hiring an expert, and the time that it takes an expert to value a business deters people from wanting to do it. And part of our job, I think, as attorneys is making sure they understand the value in it, because depending on the type of business, an expert valuation can be very expensive. And it could very much slow down the flow of the case, right? And 4 months, 5 months, 6 months until you get a valuation on a business. And a lot of people don't want to hear that, right? They want to be divorced. They want their money now. They want to be able to move on. And so being able to explain to our clients, look, this is what's involved here. This is how long it's going to take. And this is about how much it's going to cost, right? I mean, you're going to start off with $10,000, $15,000 on a business valuation. It could go as high as $40,000, $50,000, right? And making sure people understand that, and making sure there's real value in your case in doing that, right? Because again, sometimes you have these smaller businesses, the money is just not there. Nobody has $40,000, $50,000 to spend on a business valuation. And so then it leaves it up to us to be able to kind of ascertain the value from the bank records or from the records or whatever it is. So making sure that people understand the process of getting a business valuation, I think is extremely important.
And I think it's also important in that conversation with clients to have them understand you've got one spouse that owns the business, that runs the business, or especially in those cases where you have one spouse that owns the business, runs the business, and that they're not going to have an ownership interest in the business, that they're not going to have some, unless it's agreed upon, which is not advisable, to run the business going forward out the divorce.
Right.
That really the only way that they're going to get any sort of value from that in the divorce is doing the valuation. And so because that's what goes on the spreadsheet, not necessarily the interest itself. And then if it's a separate property business, you're going to want to take a deeper dive in any sort of, fraud claims or any sort of reimbursement claims, because that may be the only place that you get real value.
Right. So I know that with businesses, we often get a situation where the spouse is the only real rainmaker, so to speak, in the business, right? Like if the spouse went away, the business goes away. And so then the courts have to attribute something called goodwill, right? So that being that it is this person's persona, this person's action, this person's work, that is what really actually makes the business run. And absent this person, there would be no business. It's challenging sometimes, right, to get your client to understand that even though this business is bringing in, let's say, $500,000 to $1 million into your house, if the spouse that you are about to divorce goes away, that whole business goes away. And so then the courts have to take that into consideration. What have you done in order to maybe even dispute the amount of goodwill that an expert on the other side of your case is trying to assess?
So I do think that these expert reports on business valuations really just do come down to the assumptions. I think that everybody's going to have both experts, if there's two on each side, or one on each side. They're all going to have the same bank statements. They're all going to have the same profit and loss. And so those numbers are going to be, they're going to be consistent in whatever models they use. What really comes down to is, is there a discount rate that we're applying? Is there personal goodwill percentage that we're applying, and any of the other assumptions that are made? And so those are ultimately what I think people start fighting over. And so I think to answer your question, if somebody's going to hire an expert that's going to come up and there is a chance that this company is, there's a lot of goodwill that's attached, that's not divisible in a divorce, that's attached to a certain business, you're going to want your own expert to come in. So at least you can mitigate what that effect is going to have on the value of the business.
I've actually seen that, and it's sort of heartbreaking, right? Like if you're the spouse that's been kind of living off of it and that's what you become accustomed to. And then all of a sudden, somebody on the other side says, oh, well, it's really not worth anything that the court can divide. And so when you have a situation like that, I think that in that space, it's important, right, to start looking at the rest of the estate and preparing our clients for how you're going to how you're going to get something for them that is still valuable for them going forward. So how do you differentiate between business ownership interests and income available for support, right? Because we're in Texas, right? And so we all know we don't have alimony in Texas. We only have spousal support. But how do we value that when you're looking at a business and you're saying, okay, this business has this much money that's coming out, but the business still has to run. What are you doing to present that as a case?
Well, if I understand your question correctly, it's how do we calculate support more or less when you have a lot of money that's in the business as opposed to just what's coming out. And the best way to do that is to look at the tax returns, right? Look at the expenses. One thing that we know for certain is that when people file their taxes, they claim expenses to reduce the amount of reported income, right? Advertising, cell phones, lunches and dinners, promotional trips, things like that really shouldn't be coming out of the pot, right? So the first thing we do is we look at the tax returns. We see what types of things they're deducting. We'll see what the real income of the business is, how much the business came in. Another thing that a lot of people will employ is they'll leave the money in the business, right? So instead of paying themselves a reasonable salary, they'll pay themselves a very low salary. They'll leave the money in the business and they'll say, hey, I only make $40,000 a year, so that's all you could use to calculate child support. One of the things that you can do under those circumstances is to use market income. Hey, this is what the average person who does this type of job or who has this kind of business earns. And you could look at the business records to see, hey, instead of him paying himself a reasonable amount, he's leaving a bunch of money in the business. I think that courts take those type of things into consideration in the calculation of support. I made a mention previously that, these judges are smart. They've been there. They've done that. They've seen it. And so they know that these types of tricks are employed. And when we're talking about support, the courts can consider what we consider imputed income, right? Hidden income, underemployment, things of that nature, in the calculation of support.
Tell me some of the funniest things that you have seen on a tax return that somebody's tried to write off on a small business. Yes.
Probably designer bags, things like that. Where obvious, lots of hotel stays when the business doesn't really require travel. Okay, you figure out if somebody's maybe having any fare, and so
are we putting us at airs on our tax return?
No, but if I start seeing those kinds of expenses, it's not something that's normal to that business. I'm going to then go look at the bank statements and then start seeing what's going on. And so I would say that designer handbags, things like that, jewelry being purchased. That's probably
Katie,
interesting.
Funniest thing you've seen?
Funniest thing? I had a client that was writing off travel expenses, hotel stays, but the hotels were in Vegas. And there were gambling debts that were on there as business write-offs, not called gambling debts, but upon further review and question, that's exactly what they were.
And they were being written off on the tax return. All right. So we have affairs and gambling debts that we've gotten on our tax returns. Missy, what have you seen?
A lot of the same. A lot of the same. I had one situation that was very similar. A young man went to Vegas, said he was promoting the business, got a suite, had a party in the suite, and wrote off the cost of the party and all of the shopping and preparation.
That was the marketing cost, right?
Right, but that was in no way something that the business would need to do, right? So not a necessary business expense. So those are the type of things that people like to do. They like to disguise. Advertising is another big thing that you see people disguising, like, oh, I've spent, $30,000 in advertising. Where do you advertise? Oh, mostly on Facebook. Like, well, that's not really, you know what I'm saying? There's no way that you could substantiate that by putting a post on your Facebook and saying that this is what I do, So
what are you really advertising?
Right. So it's those types of things that you really have to analyze to determine whether or not they're real or whether it should be deducted.
And as the attorney, I used to live by the adage of be careful asking the questions you don't know the answer to. Mm-hmm. But I really do feel like it's incredibly important when you have a client who's in control of the financials in any case, but specifically their business financials. Because I think I want to know those answers before somebody else finds those answers out so we can best address them.
Right.
So,
yeah. So all of us are business owners to some degree, right? So Missy, you're a partner. Yasmin, you're a partner in your firm, that you kind of own your firms. Katie, actually, you're a partner in a firm. However, it wasn't your firm that you started originally. You started as a clerk at that firm and you worked your way up to partner. But you see the numbers, right? Because you're a partner in that firm. And so I think that all of us are familiar with what business expenses should look like, right? And so I think it gives us a little bit of insight. So when we see something that just doesn't quite pass the smell test, we can be like, I don't know if you really should have been able to write that off.
Like, should I write that off? Should I be doing that? Should I be doing that? I need a new handbag.
On the flip side, right?
That new handbag. So I think the funniest thing that I saw was that there were several vehicles that were on the tax return as all purchases for the business. And I was like, well, how many vehicles does the business really need? I mean, are we doing a fleet of vehicles? Like, well, what are we doing? And it was like, oh no, it's just normal everyday vehicles that we need. And I was like, well, okay, let's dig a little deeper in all these vehicles, all sports cars.
Yes, you did.
This is that person drives with these sports cars. So, and I thought that was pretty funny. I was like, okay, so we're doing sports
cars. Food truck with the guy who owns the food truck also owns 15 sports cars. Is it necessary?
We're not going to talk about that. All right. So, what discovery strategies are most effective in uncovering the true financial picture of a closely held business? And a closely held business obviously being one that is either family owned or is, not quite arm's length in terms of relationships. So what discovery strategies are you using?
I think that the most important things to look at, and I think we've already mentioned it, is the bank records and the tax returns. A lot of times when you're dealing with people who have these small businesses and you're asking for discovery and they have the records or they have control of the records, you're not going to get them. Mm-hmm. And I think that the same is true when you're subpoenaing records from these small businesses. When they have the records, that's really no different than them producing the records and discovery. So again, tailoring your discovery requests to the documents that are really important, the bank records, the credit card records, the tax returns, the debts of the business, making sure that you're requesting the specific documents that you need to help get a sense of what the business is worth.
I always, not always, but a lot of times, so the strategy that I like to use is the outside in. And so I will try and figure out any sort of third party, like I talked about earlier about a checks and balances, like who's involved in this. And so if we've got a third party accounting firm who is doing the tax returns and that sort of thing, any sort of banks where there's loans or, where they bank, trying to get those documents and then kind of circling the wagon and moving inward, especially if it's the litigant spouse who owns the business, to kind of circle the wagons and then move inwards and then try to reconcile the things that I know have a credible source, and then getting the books from the inside and seeing, what smell test that it passed.
Mm-hmm. I would say a couple things. One is the more and more you do it, the better and better you get. The more cases you have where you're dealing with small businesses and you have to go through it, the better you get. So, and also not being afraid of digging in and really understanding it yourself. You're going to have to take the time to look at the bank statements, look at the credit card statements, look at the tax returns, get an accountant, get somebody to translate what that means. So you have your own working understanding of what you think the business might be worth as the attorney. And I think things like subpoenaing the CPA and the records that were used to make the tax return are important. Sometimes, unfortunately, though, with a lot of these small businesses, there's a lot of cash being passed under the table, and that's really hard to do anything with that, But bank statements are great. That's a great place to start, I would say, with these kinds of cases.
How much success have you had with CPAs being open and honest with you when the CPA has been with that business for 20, 30 years? And so it's almost like they're part of the business. How much success have you had with them?
I've had really good experience. Usually if you issue a subpoena, they do turn over the records. And then I've deposed CPAs as well. And they'll mostly tell the truth when you got them under oath. And so I've actually had good experience. But that's a lot of time, effort, and money. And a lot of times the clients give up. They're tired. They don't want to spend the money to do all this. So I try to look immediately to the estate and see, is there other stuff? They own a couple of houses, some land, a ranch, cars, money in banks, retirement accounts. Sometimes the non-earning spouse will take those assets and say he can have the business or she can have the business. I'll take this other stuff because I don't want to spend the money with doing all this the forensic work that's involved.
Mm-hmm. Has anybody had any accountants or CPAs that have just been a little less than forthcoming with you when, they've been a part of the business for a long time?
Well, and I think it depends on the degree of contiguity of the relationship with the CPA. I think CPAs are licensed professionals as well, and a lot of them will take that very seriously, and will, when you get them in a deposition or under oath, will not lie. And some of them, because blood is thicker than water, may create facts to fit a certain narrative. Not to say lie, but create facts to fit a certain narrative. And so it does get tricky, but I think it depends on the degree of how close they are. If it's a family member, might have some trouble. But if it's somebody who's once or twice removed, I think you usually have pretty good luck.
Yeah, I would think when they're once or twice removed, you would. But I have had an experience with a CPA that was just not helpful at all. And no matter how many times I threatened with subpoenas and how many times I threatened with going to the board and how many times I threatened with, this could impact you quite negatively. You should probably give me these documents. And I got nothing, and my client did the exact same thing that you were saying, Yasmin. Finally, just like, you can have the business, I don't want the business. Just give me something else. But in the heat of the moment was very much, get. But as you talked about earlier, and I think may have been in the last episode, those bills start coming and they start thinking a little bit differently about, okay, what's really most important in terms of what am I going to get out of this?
Right. It's all the cost benefit analysis where you're like, if it's going to cost you $100,000 to get a value on something that's only $50,000, then it may not be worth it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Now, how does lifestyle, owner distributions, and reinvestment decisions affect how you pursue a case? So you were talking earlier about someone just leaving the money in the business. How does that affect how you pursue the representation of the spouse who's not part of the business?
I think you have to look at the business and how they historically have operated, because I think that plays a huge part in it. And if you have a client that comes in and says, we live a certain lifestyle, and you're looking at their lifestyle and you're like, well, this is, this business must be doing really well. And it may be, but if the business has never really distributed any funds and that they've been living out of the business, that's a really hard claim to make going forward, because a court isn't going to order distributions from a business because it can't.
It can't, right?
Right. And so if it's historically operated that way, then that's a hard it's a hard hurdle to get over. I think that if you have a scenario where you have a business owner who has historically made distributions and they have tax returns that reflect a certain income every year, or you've had the non-business spouse receiving a paycheck from the business. I've had that before, where they're not actually employed, but they're receiving a paycheck from the business. And if those things stop because a divorce has been filed, I think then you do have a claim that those things should continue, or that there are some issues, or this is just being done out of spite because the divorce is happening.
Missy, have you had that experience?
Which experience?
With a non-employee spouse receiving a paycheck and then
that experience.
not being a part of the
Of course, because of, to understand the structure of the business, the more people you pay, you reduce the income of the business, you reduce the tax of the business. And so, yes, I've definitely had that happen before. You had asked initially about lifestyle, and I think lifestyle comes into play in a couple of fold, specifically when we're talking about payments of support, right?
Mm-hmm.
My background was with the state. I started off with the Office of the Attorney General doing child support. And one of the things that we always thought was interesting is how people would come in and say, oh, I don't have any money. I don't have any money, right? But then you have a $900 car note and your mortgage is $3,000 and you're wearing a $10,000 watch and you have a cell phone and you have all of these things. And when we're talking about people who run their own business, a lot of times their personal expenses are coming out of the business. Mm-hmm. The business pays their car note, the business pays their mortgage. And so that's when you look at lifestyle, right? Their lifestyle, when you look at the business and kind of what they claim the business is earning as opposed to what it's really earning, because you have all these personal expenses that's running through them. And so those are things that the court can take into consideration, certainly, not only when we're talking about support, but when we're talking about valuing the business and determining how lucrative this business really is, right? I'm reporting the business only made $40,000, but I paid $35,000 in mortgage payments out of the business this year. So, those are the things that, with experience, you can pick up on as you're reviewing these tax returns and these bank records and things like that.
So what happens when the business owns the home that the parties are living in? What do we do in situations like that? Have you had that happen?
I've had scenarios where properties are owned by, or the parties buy property and put them in LLCs.
We've seen that.
Well, I think the issues I've run into with that is they get awarded in the divorce, but then you have to have special paperwork drawn out to dissolve the LLC or the thing that's holding it. And then you may have huge tax consequences as a result of taking it out of the corporate estate. I'm going to look at Katie as I'm saying this. And you may have gotten a lot of tax benefits by having it as an LLC, the property. And then all of a sudden now it's not. And then you may owe back taxes. That's something I rely on a forensic accountant to kind of walk me through, but I've had those situations. So I don't know if Katie, you would have piped in on that.
So just to piggyback on what you were saying. So when you have those business owned homes, depending on what else is in it, right? So if it's just an LLC that owns a home that was purchased during marriage and it's community and there's no There's no question about it. The characterization. Sometimes the advice would be just to transfer ownership of the business to the spouse that's going to be awarded the home, so that you don't have the untangling mess of taking it out of the name of the business or the LLC, because it has a lot of triggering events that might happen. And so sometimes we look into just if that's really the only asset in there. Sometimes there's a lot of different things in there, so it doesn't always work. But if it's truly the only asset in there, then it might just be a matter, because there are some benefits for holding properties in LLCs. And so if we can maintain that, sometimes that's the best route.
So we're here in Stafford, and sometimes I will see a business that is run out of the front, and then the family is actually living in the back. And the house in and of itself is actually in the name of the business, but the family is actually living there. And so I've had instances where we had to try and figure out, like, well, who's going to keep the home, because maybe one spouse has the children and can't really afford to keep the home, and then the business is the only thing that's really funding the home. And so we get to a situation where, practically speaking, it becomes quite difficult to divide these. And then you end up in a position where, something has to be sold, and then you get into the untangling, and you get into the tax implications of it all. And so in those instances, I have found that it has been very helpful for courts for us to be able to sort of explain some of the backstory and some of the background that helps the court to understand the implication of what it is that they're doing. So one of the things that Katie talked about in the last episode was be careful of what you ask for. And so I've had to go in and ask for something that was not actually the best, practically speaking, but it was the only option that the courts have. When you find yourself in a situation where you've got to be the deliverer of bad news, even for your own client, what are some of the things that you do to try and get over some of those hurdles of delivering this is not actually going to work out the best when we divide this? Misty?
Over-explain. I mean, I think that, and this is just a personal thing, something that I do is I try to tell people to, if you can, take the emotion out of it and think of this as a business transaction. Divorce is probably one of the most difficult things that anybody will deal with in their life, right? And it is extremely emotional, even for people who say that it's not emotional, right? I want this divorce, but it's still an emotional thing. A lot of times when we're dealing with, or not, I won't say a lot of times, all the time, when we're dealing with a divorce and we're talking about property and dividing property, you have to look at it more as a business transaction than an emotional transaction. And so when you explain, these are your options, these are the potential outcomes, put it on the table, make it as clear as possible. Put it in a spreadsheet if you have to. Make it as clear as possible and just make sure that people understand. Sometimes you have to ask for things that you don't want to, as an attorney, that doesn't make sense because that's what your client wants, right? I mean, as long as you're not breaking the law, sometimes you have to ask for things. You have to kind of bite your tongue, right? My client wants the horse, like, that doesn't make sense, but that's part of the job. That's part of why we do what we do, right? And so making sure that you are presenting their options to them and making sure that they understand the options is really all we can do, right?
Katie, what are you doing to soften the blow?
I made the client part of the decision-making process. So a lot of what Missy was saying, like sitting them down and explaining the scenarios and what our options are, and what the probable outcome would be on the options, the cost involved with going to option A, B, C, or D, and just having them involved in the next step. And I think that it is usually giving them a sense of ownership in the decision-making process is helpful.
Yasmin?
And I guess I agree with both Misty and Katie. I would just say, on top of that, thinking outside the box. when you have a situation like you just described, where there's a business being run out of the front of the house, the family's living in the back of the house. I had a situation a few years ago where I represented one of the wife they were immigrants with neither of them had beyond a high school education. They started a wholesale beauty supply business. And over the years, they paid off the land, they bought the building. It was very lucrative. And so we actually got a civil attorney, corporate attorney to draft documents, and they transitioned the business into a joint tenancy type of setup so they could continue to they both operated and used that business. And it was not easy. And we had some real reality checks and explained it over and over again. This is the deal. If the other person gets a girlfriend or a new spouse and they want to be involved in the business, you're going to be dealing with all these other entities, but they had no other option. They were never going to be successful on their own. And so they kept the business, and we switched it from them being community interest to a joint tenancy, and had all the corporate documents and did everything the right way, and it worked out. So, I mean, just learning how to think outside the box, presenting some solutions, scenario A, B, and C, making sure you really explain it and over-explain it to your client, and being willing to do those kinds of things that are not completely straightforward.
Just to piggyback real quick on what you were saying, when you're Greg, I agree with you 100% thinking outside the box and urging clients at that point when they don't like what's behind curtain 1, 2, 3, or 4, because those are the options that a court might be able to do and things we can ask for a court, encouraging, but we could do something completely different if everybody's on board, if we do it by agreement, if we do it through a more collaborative process or mediation. We can really work through some of these kinks, and having even experts come in and working jointly to come up with a solution. I think that's really helpful sometimes.
I do. I like that idea. I've not heard of that. So you're teaching me something today. So thank you. That's a little nugget that we can take away. Because I think we do have to think outside the box, because I think that courts are limited in what it is that they can do. And a court was never going to be able to do that. And so that is something that I think that we should all always consider, is why agreements are important, why they are valuable, and why it is that people should sometimes put that emotion aside. I think you talked about that, Misty, so that they can get to the logical, because that was clearly a business decision,
Right.
To stay in it and make it work. Well, I would like to say thank you to everyone for joining me for our second episode. We have one more episode left with these beautiful ladies, and so I'm really looking forward to that. But thank you for taking the time out. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the Bastine Brief with Yasmin Cuddy, Misty Dennis, and Katie Custer. I'm Ronique Bastine Robinson. See you next time.